Okay, so rather than talking kind of on the trouble with positivism in the exhibition, which I will do also, but I just decided a couple of minutes ago to try something slightly different in response to what we've heard, maybe in part, but also because I wanted to do that anyway, and maybe it's interesting to hear you responding to something that's not quite, that's maybe raw in certain aspects. Okay, these are depictions of nature from the 17th century. The first one on the upper left is by the philosopher and Dr. Robert Flood. And you see sort of the apish human on a chain tied to God. Apish here is kind of understood as positive, as someone endowed with the ability to mine nature, like a mimetic animal, not in the debunking sense of the merely mimetic, in the sense of being able to engage and understand, to become a naturalist. The second image, the one in the center below, is, do you say that in English? Rosicrucian? Is that
sorry?
Rosenkreuz or Rosicrucians?
No, in English.
Yeah.
In English or Rosicrucians?
Michael Mayer is his name. There's plenty of these images from that time, and in the overwhelming majority of them, you would see nature represented as a woman guiding the naturalist, guiding the scientist. But also interesting here, I mean, in the Kirchner image on the right, from the one that dates, the others date from 1617 and 1618 respectively. This one's from 1680, the Kirchner image. The kind of depictions of light, of course, are interesting. It's kind of divine light, but the divine light in all of these depictions always is also having a potential other dimension, which is basically that nature itself is understood as the divine medium. That's a crucial, for me, it's been always something I kept thinking about. So the turn on the positivism question that I'll try out now is basically, I'll return to something that was some of the manifestations in concrete exhibition projects, but sort of under this heading of the medium question and perhaps the trouble with the anima as something that is kind of resisting objectification and therefore is not quite easy to exhibit. Right? Our being in a medium as a condition that we can't objectify, that we can't render into a thing. As well as the anima as an object of theological contestation and as a design question, first of theology, later of other disciplinary ontological troublemakers. So this is actually taken from the animism exhibition, where there was a contribution, a kind of scholarly contribution called Iconography of Mediumism. And what we tried to do with that, Erhard Schüttpelz, Ela Voss, and a third person, the doctor whose name is Scholz, I think. Sorry for that. So what we tried to do, the four of us, was basically understanding how the modern terms and the division between the disciplines responsible for certain concepts and objects pertaining to media, communication, psyche, spirituality, etc. came into being. What's the prehistory of that, where these concepts were not yet settled, where the disciplines that are now in charge of these troublemaking objects were not yet settled, and this leads straight into this kind of quarrels, anarchic almost debates over the question of mediumism. And sort of the background nature as a medium is interesting here. This continues with something like that. Who's familiar with this, with mesmerism?
Translation.
Mesmerism was a very popular kind of collective ritual / cure, right, that swept France and the rest of Europe during the kind of a phase of modernity that would soon see technological media coming into being. Mesmerism is, in a way, you could say, also a secularization or modernization of possession rituals. And it is also borrowing from these ideas of nature as the divine medium, secularized in the sense of being endowed with mediumistic forces in the imaginary of Mesmer, a fluidum that would sort of run through all living things, flow through all living things, and disease and illness basically being a result from blockage. You could say it's kind of like the Chinese qi, not that different. And the rituals that were performed in order to get that fluidum flowing again were basically, here you see an indoor ritual, but most of them were actually conducted outside around trees, and they were kind of designed to collect this fluidum in batteries and then release it. Basically a shamanistic kind of trance, in the sense that it really tried to induce a crisis that would then flip into a cure, like this kind of strange dialectical inversion that is so typical of mediumistic practices, and of course not only then also pertain to mediums such as the exhibition. The kind of field in which mesmerism took place was unsettled. It had a huge kind of colonial repressed dimension, not only of colonialism outside of Europe, but equally the colonization within, Inquisition, witch hunt, etc. Wherein basically possession became sort of the emblem of the non-modern, and the very opposite of this kind of the rational, self-possessing subject that sort of pertains to liberal political philosophy with its foundational phase, but actually goes back to the very, very origins of European colonialism in the 15th and even 14th century, when I forgot the name again, I don't have it easily at hand. I forgot which pope it was, but the papal bull, I think from 1423, which declared that only Christians have what was then called dominion, the right to possess and to be in self-possession. Very important, because this later returns in the philosophies of the likes of John Locke and other kind of founding fathers of modern political philosophy. And the opposite of that self-possessing subject that is constituted, that gains its right of being self-possessing through being able to possess, to own property, was mediumism, meaning in its extreme forms, rights of possession, as opposed to an active stance, a passive stance, as opposed to productionist, poesis, pathos. and passiones, as it was often called as well. So the mesmerism was often indistinguishable from multitude of practices such as hypnosis. A lot of it reappears in spiritism later, and sort of in the high age of imperialism and industrialization, somehow informs and flows into this kind of age of nervosity, in which for a few decades there's still no clear distinction between technological media and personal media, like becoming a medium through a ritual or in the hypnosis session, etc. Who's familiar with the story of Judge Schreber? Famously written about by many people, such as Bestiary. So a kind of a case of a very severe schizophrenia, who famously and amazingly wrote about his own case, a book recounting his experience, that is basically used by the Bestiary to get to their concept of becoming woman, etc. Basically, he's in a delirium of becoming passive, of becoming a medium of all kind of forces, divine rays, etc. In a strange, like you could say that Schreber's condition is like this man here on the lower side of the picture. This is of course a generalization and a reduction. The Schreber case is extremely complex and interesting, but in terms of a pathology of the passive, also of a body being overwhelmed by a new technological envelope, right? This is like this kind of drawing in the upper part of the picture. This kind of, the mere fact of being kind of plugged into these new communication networks, or this kind of typical caricature from the time, singing praise on the achievements of modern civilization, more lamenting the fact that it has upset all the pace of life, plunges everybody into an unbearable nervosity. What matters here, I mean, I'm showing these images also because this mediumism discourse becomes a discourse of the nervous system. Freud is of course quite crucial in sort of, really like basically putting an end to to a long debate on the mediumism, or the forms of mediumism. Although of course he borrowed, I mean basically there is in the psychoanalytic cure, of course, one aspect that is straight borrowed from the mediumistic genealogy, which is the transference. That perhaps one kind of polemically could identify with this famous mirror hanging in his next to his desk for most of his Vienna working life. This is from Alfred Geld's Art and Agency. Who's familiar with this book? Only 2 people, 3, 4. Okay. I don't think I have the time to go into this, to present the book. It's really an interesting book in many respects. As a serious attempt at an anthropology of art that is, able to cross the kind of ontological partitions inherent to the modern art system, at least to an astonishing degree. But I basically just want to remain with this diagram because what he calls here the art Naxals, describing sort of the kind of various symmetries and tipping points between the active and the passive, between working on and being worked on, one could easily imagine also as being called not the art nexus but the media nexus, as something that one could perhaps imagine as being this line that he draws as a diagonal, as being a permanent source of trouble for any description attempt at describing medialities. Somehow, because this transfer between the active and the passive is not used to be, let's say, in the paradigm of Western thought, black boxed, particularly the dimension of the passive. So what I'm trying to get at is basically the sense that we really don't have a language, a kind of literacy even, with respect to the dimension of patienthood. Not in terms of art, not in terms of, although of course the artist is perhaps the one kind of profession in modernity whose mediumistic abilities, like letting, like you could of course find many examples where maybe we come close to developing something like a language. We're not sure if that is always a linguistic or a signifying language, but, and to what degree it can be. Right? That's an interesting question, of course. But you have, of course, the history of the avant-garde and modern art is full with mediumistic attempts, from the automatic drawing to, let's say, to something like Eva Hesse saying that her work is not about, it's not a productionist thing in terms of shaping formless matter into form, but rather the opposite, a process that forms the subject. Right? You follow me so far? This is a longer Simondon quote, and an interesting one, I think, particularly for the kind of statement that he makes in the very end of this quote. But but let's say it's a quote, but one could also find other quotes to describe the same thing. Such as Latourian quotes on what is a matter of fact and the kind of eclipse of mediation that produces this. So that would be sort of the problem of the medium exhibition as a kind of exemplary format in which objectification and singification occurs. It is somehow tied, the scopic regime is somehow tied to this gap in which true mediation disappears. Hylomorphic is basically, one could also say, in other words, in order not to lose oneself in philosophical definitions, in other words, the ideology of productionism. Man the maker forming formless and senseless matter. So it's basically the history of tool making and matter shaping. In a sense, you could say that what concerns me curatorially, trying to find ways of addressing these problems inside the medium exhibition, and it's kind of strange scripts, like not protocols that are not really spelled out or written, like they're just part of the genealogy of this weird ritual with its architectures, because it is kind of not really. He's an artist I work with a lot, Peter Friedels, and he polemically says, like, to exhibit is not natural. And nothing enters into an exhibition without being profoundly transformed. You could say that I try to somehow find ways to address this gap and to find different manifestations of it. And perhaps there's another quote that addresses something related, but shifts also the registers to important, sort of like almost like an engine, like an engine for thought and kind of working method. It's this kind of excerpt from the preface of the History of Madness, and this kind of description of a kind of primordial drawing of the socios through an act of division that becomes the fundament for a system of positive binaries. What's important for me in this quote is the necessarily forgotten. So we're not talking sort of about the structuralist system of opposites. We're talking about that gesture of division that makes them possible in the first place. And the second thing that's important for me is exactly that. It's this line, the last before the last, it creates the division which gives its positive face. So positivism is owed to forgetting that other division. So the question is, it's a little bit like thinking about the frontiers, both geographical, cultural, and of knowledge, of the known and the unknown, of the real territory of the signified, etc., and of certain orders, etc. And what Michael Tausig would then say, the frontiers are kind of always haunted by this epistemic murkiness. And so somehow one needs to identify this epistemic darkness and murkiness in order to get to this point of this necessarily forgotten gesture. It must somehow, if that were possible at all, let's say others than through the mediumistic practice of letting the unconscious speak on a couch, then it must have to do something with a gestural realm, like a gestural and a realm of an imaginary, where what happens in our image spheres that define our cultural literacies, visual literacies and others, we must find the very shape and traces of this originary division. And also a kind of mediality that is not yet divided up. This is perhaps the other side of that attempt. So I'm trying to think, what would be necessary in order to get to, I'm shifting back to the earlier suggestion, what would be necessary to get to enable ourselves to build this kind of language of the passive side, of the patienthood in the graph of Gall, rephrased as media nexus. And I think it has, perhaps, maybe I'll be able to make that a bit more clear. It would have to do with understanding a bit better the genealogies of this phenomena of mediality, mediumism, being in a medium, and milieus, environments, backgrounds. Okay, I'll return to this image in a second, but let me just put this quote up in terms of background. So this is this geographer and philosopher of affect, Nigel Thrift. Again, there's one could find many such quotes, the kind of technicity and increasing exposure of all previous background conditions becoming increasingly figures. This is also a process that, of course, also Latour has his version of it now, stable nature gradually becoming unstable through anthropogenic interventions, and hence in need of new figuration, because it no longer works as this kind of imputed background on which all human activity depends. The whole kind of media theory of the likes like Catherine Hales and Chana Parisi, etc., it is based on analyzing this kind of traffic of mobilized background conditions through basically the morphing of this background into a technological infrastructure entrenched into what was previously called nature. I think that also a Catherine Hales quote. No, I deleted it, sorry. Okay. This for me is a montage with the upper left image being from a Howard Farocki film, the lower left, of course, everybody recognizes, that somehow speaks about something that happens with this background and sort of the shifts and inversions of frontier histories. And I like to think of this particular image in two terms. One is the winter of artificial intelligence. It's a deliberate misunderstanding of an existing term. And the other is, again, a Latourian concept that he developed together with a primatologist in the 80s, Shirley Strum, when analyzing, kind of coming from an ethno-methodological quarrel about modeling sociality and society against sort of the orthodoxy of the sociobiologists, but trying to rescue the good of the sociobiology, etc. Basically analyzing baboon society and arriving at a rather interesting marrying of two concepts, the complex and the complicated. And what you see in these two images are basically related to the frontier of the complicated conquering the complex. So what does that mean? The complex in Strom-Latourian's definition is basically anything that can be submitted to a stable protocol. The complex is something that has, whose course of action is at any time vulnerable to being interrupted and entirely transformed. So what that means is, for instance, if one of you would now start to shout and undress, we would all be bewildered and perhaps feel our primate bodies doing things to us, because we have a lot of measures of stabilization that make this protocol of lecture, listening, making notes, etc., something that makes it absolutely possible for us to rely on the stability of this protocol. So none of these interactions will change the course of that if not seriously interrupted. You will leave this room transformed or deviated only on a very narrow, in a very narrow scope, which is the realm of ideas, etc. This is, all these protocols are designed only to shape that particular part without being addressed as whatever other elements we are made of. Right? They give the example in a different context, a conversation at a bar as being complex, whereas the timetable of the metro is complicated, merely complicated. Why? Because all the variables that determine the timetable of the metro are known and can basically be computed, although computed is not the only criteria. Like, stabilization is more important. So architecture is originally where, let's say, protocols of stabilization, turning complex relations into complicated ones begins. They also give this example in the text on the baboon societies. Baboon society doesn't have, let's say, a desk in a post office, with the little window, the glass, etc., and all these other protocols that are basically designed to make a very particular action executable by reducing the possibility of interruption to the utmost degree. So you could also think of this in terms of, baboon society is basically one that is highly complex socially and permanently transforming. And that's how they try to rephrase the difference between other primate societies and human society. They have very little means of stabilizing their society. Hence, it is permanently in transformation. The status of each member has to be reinvented in each communicative act. No alpha animal is stable in its position. Everything has to be renegotiated permanently and could completely transform. This is something that was not kind of given in primatology up until the late 70s, 80s, mainly through the intervention of a series of female primatologists that Haraway has written about in Dread Depths, that have proven sort of that primate societies, contrary to their male predecessors' assumptions, is not following a sort of primate pattern that is kind of, stable or programmed into the genes, but is this highly social, complex, transformative thing where no one primate society equals the other, and no species, has a kind of fixed pattern, etc. You find many different kind of baboon societies, many different kind of ways of organizing their social life. In a different Latourian context, you could say that this complex, complicated thing could also be applied to the concept of the immutable mobiles. That he describes how a certain colonial captain would arrive in some island, wherever, in the South Seas, say, and the very first time he arrives, this encounter with both the native inhabitants but also with nature is exactly of complex nature. It's potentially entirely transformative and face-to-face and dialogic, and no one element will leave this encounter untransformed. But already the second ship, based on the logbooks and the maps drawn by the first one, has a set of stabilities that make this an asymmetric encounter. Because they no longer rely on intra-subjective produced momentary knowledge. So I think very important, that's why I like this idea of the conversation at the bar versus the timetable. Because we know exactly that in any social situation that we are in that is not or less protocoled than a situation like this one, there's always this excitement about the possibility, like an exciting conversation is one that doesn't leave you untransformed, right? But it's also one in which you feel somehow parts of your body being activated that are not activated in let's say, complicated situations. You could think that, I just think that this kind of notion of a frontier, progressive frontier, is maybe helpful to understand a set of inversions that we're currently experiencing that make perhaps a language for this mediality question necessary. And should enable us, rather than, my proposition would go something like this, rather than inventing more sort of new materialisms, we should perhaps try to invent a critical mediumism, which is not non-materialist, but tries to address questions pertaining to this gap or to the murkiness or to the articulation and possibility of politicizing the changing background, the changing milieu, and how we are being made in it, like this passive factor of the graph. How so? Imagine the immutable mobile scenario, like the captain arriving at the island with the map, etc. This is a kind of, you could think of, most civilizationary tales as told in school books, museums, etc., basically account for this history of a linear progressive frontier in which we are increasingly overtaking complexity with the complicated, right? Thus, part of that is a production of colonial mythology, the idea of wildness, Mr. Herzog's trembling voice, etc. You can dive into these imaginaries in various different states and how they were organized from the Sumeric age to Avatar. Now, I think that this avatar image and the hand here, and this is where my other term comes in, the winter of artificial intelligence, in this deliberate misreading of this term, they help us to understand what happens to this progressive frontier of the complicated taking over the complex, as a kind of colonial tale of the grit of rationality gradually mastering the planet. This is kind of very typical scene from a Farocki movie. Many of these films contain often very long sequences on the factory work. And what he looks at here is basically, he basically zooms into a production process where there is a female worker. And what exactly is this worker doing, and how are they currently trying to rationalize her away? And what happens is basically you have small metal parts, I don't know for what they use, but they come on a conveyor belt and they fall into a basket and they need to be aligned into a different conveyor belt in a particular position for the next production process. And for this transition from this position to that, they need, until now, a human being. And they haven't automatized it yet. Why exactly these things have to fall into a basket, I don't know. They do fall into a basket, and that is the complex situation. And it's no longer complicated. This basket, these things fall in ways that are not easily managed by a mechanical machine. Here he goes into the laboratory where various machines are kind of biomimetically adapted in engineering processes to be able to handle more complex situations, less mechanical ones. And of course, for that to work, you will ultimately have to have a machine or eventually have to have a machine that is equipped with pattern recognition that just is able to detect all possible positions in which this metal part could have fallen. And then grab it and realign it, which of course is what eventually happens. But this very process is, an instantiation of this frontier of complicated protocols overtaking complex relations. And of course, there's this kind of cultural anxiety around now because we realize that neural net technology, etc., is able to take over complex tasks and perhaps even forms of our sociality that we previously somehow felt safe from sort of being uniquely human cognitive abilities. The second image here, the avatar image, I think is relevant in exactly that sense. I mean, basically because what you see is a technology that was developed to make the process of CGI produced hyper-realist animation, computer-generated imagery more economic, because basically constructing an actor completely in the computer is just enormously laborious, but also because of that problem of the winter of artificial intelligence. This is a concept that normally is used to describe a period in artificial intelligence research where basically the discipline didn't live up to the expectations and funding has been frozen. People give different periods, but depending on which institution, but like let's say roughly late 60s to early mid 80s, much of what people had hoped they would be able to achieve has not been achieved. They hit a certain glass wall that many of the technologies they developed were then resurrected in the 90s and 2000s as computing power grew exponentially, and they could be made useful simply based on the capacity of the computers. But this winter of artificial intelligence can also be applied, I think, for another phenomena. It's a little bit like polemic to do that. That has been a consistent problem for animators in the construction of human bodies. Like not animators that are actually drawing, right? Not the kind of Disney, but computer animation, which is human walking. It's relatively easy to get a face and all the mimics, the arms, etc. All of this right, but human walking is a huge problem. It always looks robotic. You don't get it organic. So it's somehow the winter of artificial intelligence here would describe the inability to reconstruct the lifelike and cross the uncanny valley. The uncanny valley being that sort of zone of like but not quite horror, like that defines the entire sort of very physically grounded aesthetic border management of what we perceive as threatening, cute, etc. The kind of monstrology that defines the liminal conditions of our imaginary. Can you follow me? What's funny about this avatar image is that, in a way, it's really like technology, like the origins of cinema itself. Right? It's nothing about it is new, and it doesn't even look like very different. I mean, on other photographs you see it better. The bodies being equipped with the same kind of recognition points that Etienne Marey and Muybridge and others would use in their motion capture studies from the late 19th, early 20th century, the kind of proto-cinematic history and the rationalization history of the factory. But here, this technology is basically used to get over this problem of human walking. Right? It has other benefits, but let's say that's the main reason. The main reason is that you have to work so much on the question of uncanny valley. If you construct it entirely in the computer, it's much better to get human actors into the laboratory, extract human movements from these white points on the black suits or from the face, etc., and then lay this digital character on top of that. And I think that somehow is emblematic of this condition of what has happened in this frontier of the complicated and the complex, because that means that the complicated and the problems associated with complication, meaning now computation and its outsides, or it's no longer outsides, or like the mechanistic paradigm still partially associated with it, etc. The problems of the winter of artificial intelligence, if one accepts this term as a kind of polemic identification of the instrumentality problem of the complicated frontier, have been resolved by basically inverting the frontier itself, in the sense of becoming an envelope. And our complicated sociality and everyday operations are filling in the gaps or the holes or in other words, are animating this infrastructure. And that's an interesting inversion. Can you follow me on this argument? So the complicated now is no longer that which, progressively conquers the complex, like civilization in the dominant imaginary would conquer the wild. Right? The complicated is now what frames us. It frames and encloses complexity. So rather than this kind of progressive colonial frontier, if one wants to associate it with its histories, or just frontier, we are now increasingly seeing islands of complexity governed in merely complex operations, while at the same time complexity informs this infrastructure of the complicated in ways that produce a kind of massive transformation of this background in the Nigel Thrift sense, producing a kind of feedback and a transformation of both the complicated and the complex in ways that we are not quite yet able to grasp. And that's basically this algorithmic environmentality, in which what we get mirrored back, in which basically data become the primary object through which we interact with the world. So basically, everything that we don't encounter, we rarely encounter anything face to face in this kind of scene of transformative baboon-like in social intensity. But most things somehow rendered, filtered through data and its interfaces. It's never the raw data, because that doesn't look quite human enough for our convenience. And you basically begin to interact mostly with processes where any complexity is already rendered through the complicated. Does this make sense? Someone thinks that this doesn't make sense? I think, how much time do I still have left?
15 minutes.
Yeah.
Take it.
I mean, this would be perhaps, on the kind of level of both iconography and computation and the weather. Iconography, be an interesting kind of sample, not to think through complexity and complication, in the sense that clouds are ultimately complex, and still there are huge troubles in computing them and computing the weather. I mean, so obviously, as probably everybody noticed, the weather forecast did get better, more accurate to about a week from like 3-4 days in the last few years. So the frontier here is moving as the amount of sensors, and computers used to basically model and compute the climate is just overwhelming and growing exponentially. But still, the weather is, still 7 days is rather poor, we have to say. So it's somehow, I like this fact, to identify the cloud with with a complexity and with seeing this kind of frontiers of climate change with its political dimensions, with its apocalyptic dimensions, and that somehow as related as a related dimension. But of course also the cloud, like a little bit perhaps looping back to the nature as a medium, the clouds in kind of Western iconography has a particular interesting status, like in its relation to divinity, mediumisms, and milieus, or milieus of mediality that normally are theologically connotated or have to be theologically framed, because that is theology is the narrative genre in which mediality gets engineered for up until it becomes out of fashion to do that. When soul design is no longer a question of theology, but becomes handed over to other disciplines who are not yet quite knowing what to do with it. And then, what deep mind reads in the clouds, an image that probably everybody has seen by now, which is, a weird thing, like somehow a machine fed with millions of images, designed as a neural net, would begin to behave or mimic that which was always the accusation of a mimetic relationship to nature, of children and other groups packed into this basket of the archaic in modern mythologies. So sort of the the kind of standard misunderstanding of what animism is, no? To read shapes into something that actually isn't that thing, right? Or to perceive something as having subjecthood that's actually just an object, or to treat something as a person that isn't a person. This is the standard accusation of the colonial rationality against the cosmographies and ontologies, if you will, that are drawing other distinctions. But of course, I mean, in getting in this kind of terrain of animism, one always has to say, first and foremost, that there is no such, that sort of, it's the most, animism is the most normal thing, and there are many manifestations of it. But the kind of gap in the hylomorphic projection that I've mentioned earlier, or the epistemic murkiness or the eclipse of mediation that produces a particular form of very warlike positivity, if you will, does something very specific with this, most normal thing. Why is it most normal? Because somehow in every social practice, by necessity, needs to figurate, if you will, the forces on which its own sociality depends. So, and also to produce a sort of, maybe not only, let's say, language, but let's say an expression of the dimensions of enacting that social practice. So the kind of standard deconstruction of this accusation that somehow here is now becoming the property of the machine would be, that for instance, personalization of non-human agents is a result of socializing, rather than first you project and then you socialize. That is, I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear here. And also, I really don't, perhaps I'm not clear also because I really don't know yet what to think about that, and whether it's even relevant to where its relevance may lie. I mean, obviously, this, what one may read as sort of a machine on Orientalist LSD, may, in fact, is just part of the frontier of complicated protocols, meaning in this case algorithms, self-learning algorithms, getting better and better at pattern recognition, and basically what you see is just pure error. So pure error, exactly mirroring this kind of accusation of early anthropologists, 19th and early 20th century, saying that the primitive is making just an error, projecting his own feelings into nature, like the classic argument. So maybe we just see in this case an actual error, right? Because in the earlier error that animists were accused of, this is a strange inversion, because what this projection was actually done by the anthropologists, right? Projected ontological distinctions onto situations where they didn't apply, in grave and not very careful misreadings, but not only, I mean, overwhelmingly, but not only. Now, perhaps we're just seeing a kind of, manifestation of that frontier somehow going into the realm of figuration itself. That realm of figuration that, somehow the Gestalt theorists may have related to when they said that, contrary to the kind of Cartesian, or what is generally held as the Cartesian inner representation, somehow there are these kind of cognitive schemes and forms that are already always pre-informed, coming from perhaps what one could relate to as a gestural realm, like a gesturally embodied and practiced realm of non-linguistic cognition. And perhaps this is exactly the realm that is now being that is now being that is now about to be conquered. It would make sense even on the linguistic level, calling it a neural net. Right? But I think it's important to keep in mind that this neural net thing relies on an equation that is at least reductionist, if not in other ways extremely complicated, which is the equation of the binary computer with the synapses of the nervous system in the brain. Like the origin, one of the three original pillars of cybernetics, the article that sort of gave way to the entire project of human-machine integration, which then produced this technological envelope in which we are now feeding our complexity to the complicated rather than this previous frontier-like one. And that article was called Logical Calculus Immanent to Nervous Activity and equated the synapses with a logical game, saying it does exactly what the computer does, 0 or 1, true or false. And this is the entire sort of the engineering base for the cyber, what then on the level of the popular imaginary becomes sort of the reconciliation of modernity with if you will, an animist imaginary, at least in the sense that it renders machines, humans, and animals intelligible to each other as modeled as information systems. And perhaps, this image here, I'm trying to find out, maybe someone has an idea that helps me thinking this through. I'm trying to find out whether this image can also tell us something about sort of the new intimacy or intimate relation between capitalist frontiers and the kind of what a certain left canon calls the real subsumption of life, or sociality, if you will, to animism, right? And this is something that appears in many writers' analysis, and some of whom I've also worked with, let's say, the kind of like Maurizio Lazzarato and drawing on Guattari, etc. Or here commenting on Achille Mbembe's recent book, The Critique of Black Reason, where, as in other lectures that he's given, he permanently now draws on this equation of capitalism having become animistic, but never quite explains what he means. Like never quite makes this link specific. So I'm looking for ways of both understanding this link better and also perhaps seeing if and in what way does it tie in with this kind of instantiation of the frontier that is manifesting this DeepMind, Google DeepMind image. Now, for the remaining 5 minutes, I maybe just show a few samples from the exhibition. This was a show I did in 2008, on the poster. Everybody knows the Roger Quelois article on legendary cyclisthenia, perhaps. It's a very interesting article in many respects, in the sense of trying to understand these inversions that happen in a mimetic relationship between an organism and its environment, but actually beginning with this kind of rather amazing overture, where it says like, basically all thought is a matter of distinction, which is obviously true, of being able to differentiate, etc. And then kind of walking through a few binaries. Some of them may have collapsed historically by now, but then saying sort of, and no boundary is more clear-cut than that between an organism and its environment. And then the rest of the article proves that statement wrong. It's far from clear-cut, and actually of the greatest interest to understanding both the morphology, what an image is, he sets up this fantasy of mimetic animals that imitate the space or features of the space in which they behave, look like the leaf on which they sit, but they are basically psychotics that lose their self-centeredness to the space, they lose themselves and become sort of frozen ecstatics, which perhaps, he later says in a later work on mimicry, he withdraws from that series, puts this whole question much more in the realm of evolutionary gains. But it's very interesting to think psychopathologies as in this border sense, like depression, for instance. What is depression as in the kind of ecology, if you will, an environment's border, a border of an organism to its environment. There's a psychiatrist writing in a book called Imagination and Pathology. It's a really brilliant book on depression and on the visual world of depression, and it's following this whole sociological analysis that sort of with the transformation to control societies, it's kind of Alan Ehrenberg like from we move from neurosis and this kind of nervosity, the border pathologies of the psychotic and the neurotic, which are basically animist pathologies, right? Because you read too much of yourself in the environment, or otherwise you're not having a proper hygiene of subject-object differentiation. To this age of our age, the age of control, or being sort of emblematic for depression, and depression being a sort of demobilization of the subject, no more access to transformative forces. That would mean too much complication and no complexity, too little baboon sociality. But she also describes it, Jennifer Church is her name, as basically a kind of, she says, I think she calls it a false oneness with the world, kind of, which perhaps I would think maybe has more to do with the manic part. A manic, like a oneness on which one cannot act, right? So this is the false, being demobilized, but sort of oceanically one. I think that really sharp, it's a precise thought picture to understand visual culture, like a lot of visual culture, with its kind of permanent ideological interpellation for sort of synaptic connection, dialogic oceanism. Is that the word? Yeah. The oceanic sort of this enchanted underworld of gloomy, glowing, synaptic, organic communication. So the mimetism thing, I was just wanting to bring this in to tell you that this border, this membrane, has been sort of one of these methodological concepts through which one can, I try to program exhibitions in a way, trying to tell histories of these borders and its conceptualizations and the way images, and the way they are embodied in images. But then here, this particular set of works, this particular film would be one of the works, where also this question of the positivism, the hysterical blindness, addressed very specifically. It's a beautiful fake documentary about an alleged Bontoc ancestor of the filmmaker himself from the Philippine highlands, becoming an exhibit in the St. Louis 1904 World Fair, and his descendant trying to reconstruct his story and following it up until the skull in the Smithsonian. This is a constructed story, but a possible story, and in fact a group of Bontoc were exhibited in St. Louis, and their skulls may have ended in the in the Smithsonian, as most of them died from disease. This is, I mean, obviously a story that has repeated itself in many other instantiations. It may be sort of one of the most poisoned examples of the hysterical blindness in the positivist display of an exhibition, whereas the object is actually kept alive, right? Because of course, for most other forms of exhibition, the de-animation is a precondition for most things to enter the museum, because the complexity of life is not compatible with the protocols of musealization and this mode of history writing. Artistically, politically, like relating to works like that, the kind of mobilization. I mean, this is a work. 83 is a time when the debates over sociobiology and feminism are raging. A way of a kind of critical counter-mimesis, you could say. Anyway, it takes me too long if I go too deeper into this. Just wanted to say that this, for instance, are pictures from the Manifesta in 2008, same year, called The Soul, or Much Trouble in the Transportation of Souls, that had to do with this kind of, or was the first attempt in an exhibition. What was written on the sign you just showed me? 1 minute?
I didn't show anything. Yeah.
Did you not? Okay, I thought I'm hallucinating. Where this kind of non-objectifiable historical object of our anima, the source of complexity and of the ability to be in a medium of communication, sort of became the subject of an exhibition in this very place where, according to Monsieur Foucault, significant engineering and design applications have formatted European subjectivity. The Council of Trent in the 16th century that took place at 100 meters from the location of this exhibition. And what we tried to do was basically build around a group of artworks that had all to do with the kind of trouble in mediation and in addressing relations of mediation and the asymmetries of power inscribed into them, the tipping points, the inversions, etc., to kind of stabilize these difficult discourses that are somehow, visual discourses, gestural discourses that we have trouble due to our lack of a critical mediumistic language to properly translate into discourse, to stabilize them by placing a couple of museums around them that were sort of sketches for possible museums of the soul, that would relate, for instance, to the Council of Trent and the way the soul has been redesigned by the Catholic Church as a response to the Reformation through things like the rituals of penance and particularly the confession, sort of turning, the script for the confession. First, confession was kind of became a major ritual after the Council of Trent existing before, but being not close to the same importance. And the crucial distinction that Foucault marks out here in relation to all kind of other things, such as Trent was also chosen because of the importance of this region in the Inquisition, because of the pagan, mostly female pagan cults that persisted in this region. For instance, Carlo Ginzburg wrote about in his tracing of the iconography of the witches' cellar. Foucault says the crucial distinction was no longer had you only to tell what you were actually doing, what your sins were, but what you were thinking, what you were imagining, what you were desiring. Right? Like this kind of paradoxical internalization of self-colonization through externalization, through discursive externalization, an interesting sort of bringing into being through inversion, like of the. So the idea was maybe, is it possible to musealize this inner colonization process, just as one could perhaps make the outer colonization process into a subject matter for which the Council of Trent was equally important, basically designing the image policy of the Catholic Church for Latin America. I think I probably should stop here, and in the afternoon session we can perhaps look into some other images.